Hi, everybody. Welcome to our presentation on data harvesting. I usually refer to this as a kind of orientation meeting that's related to data and technology and DPLA. So all of you are either in the process of putting together an application, have put in an application, and are working on your kind of technology and metadata, getting it set up, but not yet kind of regularly harvested by DPLA. There we go. So I'm Gretchen Gigan. I'm the Data Services Coordinator, and I'm actually the interim network manager. So I deal with all of our relationships with our libraries. Also on the line from DPLA is Scott Williams. He's the developer for our Ingest software systems at DPLA. So Scott is here to help answer any questions if they come up that are things that he would be able to answer better than I would. This is a look at the agenda of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go over some basics of just how metadata aggregation works at DPLA. We'll talk about the requirements for DPLA. We'll talk about the actual process of how we do our ingest. We'll talk a little bit about data quality, and then we'll talk about next steps for you as you prepare for that first data ingest. So to start off, DPLA's main activity is metadata aggregation. So we gather metadata from our hubs, and then we make that metadata free for all to find and build on further. Content hubs, which you can see at the top, are single institutions or very large organizations that share records directly with DPLA. Service hubs, on the other hand, which are represented on the bottom, represent statewide or regional collaborations of partnering institutions that aggregate and then share records from all their partners with DPLA. So the hubs both aggregate records so that DPLA doesn't have to have individual relationships with all of the institutions, but they also help to build resources for their community and help build capacity in institutions and help build kind of collaboration in that region. What is shared with DPLA is a metadata record only, and within the record is a link to a digital surrogate for the original object where it resides at the original institution. So we don't actually aggregate digital objects, we only aggregate metadata. So DPLA, at a kind of bird's eye view, we have 29 million plus records. We're very close to 30 million at this point. We have 41 hubs sharing data with us, and there's 11 more hubs that are in some phase of development, either in early stages of getting together to write an application, or have actually applied but have not yet had data submitted to DPLA. We have about 3,000 contributing institutions that those service hubs in turn represent. And they give us data in 11 different metadata schema. So we're going to talk more about the metadata process, but you can see that there's just basically a lot of variety in the types of organizations and the types of data we're dealing with. So I'm going to talk about the harvest, the metadata harvest and synchronization process first. So the overall process involves an initial metadata harvest from you. At that initial harvest, a unique identifier is assigned to each record that's based on an identifier in the record. That identifier needs to be persistent over time because we periodically reharvest your entire collection of metadata so that we can then synchronize what we have with what you have. So if an identifier changes in the interim, we won't be able to match those records and we'll end up with a duplicate, the old one and the new one, or we'll remove the old one and have the new one at the new identifier. And the identifier is the DPLA URL. So you can see this long string down here, oops, underneath this item. The end of that URL represents the DPLA identifier, which is basically algorithm hash of an identifier in the original record. So basically that means if the identifier for this item changed, then the URL for this item would change. harvest is usually an OAI harvest of metadata. Most of our partners use the OAI PMH protocol for metadata harvesting to share records with us, and this means that they share XML records in a single feed that we can retrieve through an HTTP request. But we do also work with several institutions that just directly transfer XML or other JSON files to us over like an FTP protocol. We have worked with Resource Sync, but not so many of our partners have implemented this. It's a new standard, or it's a revision of the OAI standard, but it's one we could work with. Other institutions have their own APIs, and we have been successful working with some of those. But an institution's API, if they want to set it up on their own, really needs to be set up for bulk download, not kind of record by record interactions. Excuse me. Ooh, too many slides. There we go. So we don't actually recommend to you any particular software or technology for aggregating and sharing records with us. A lot of our partners are currently using a tool called Repox to publish an OAI feed, and we do sponsor a list and a small repository of some XSL style sheets on our wiki for people who are using Repox. Other partners have developed their own kind of in-house solutions, and one of our partners is currently developing a new open source software solution that they are going to share with our community called Combine. And we're actually, DPLA is going to be sponsoring a webinar about Combine in December. You can find that on our website at our events, which is a link in the footer, and then workshops. If you'd like to sign up for it, we're also going to record that. But basically, we don't ourselves publish a feed of records. So we don't have a lot of firsthand experience with a lot of the tools that our partners use. We also deal at a much larger scale with 30 million records and 40 contributing institutions. So your best bet, if you're interested in getting some input and feedback on a software or technology to use for aggregation, is to talk to other hubs, and we can help you get in touch with them. We have found that process-wise, our most successful partners use a process that's kind of similar to ours, which is that they harvest metadata from their partners, they perform a normalization or mapping and do some remediation activities to get all of those records consistent, and then they publish a feed of normalized records to us. And that's similar to what we do. We harvest metadata from you, and then we perform normalization and mapping to make all of those records consistent before we make them available through our API. The last stipulation related to metadata harvesting and aggregation is that you have to publish a single feed of data. So if you're harvesting metadata from a couple of partners, and some of them are using, say, the mods metadata schema, and others are using Dublin Core, you are responsible for first converting all of those records to the same metadata schema, be it mods or Dublin Core or something else. And then you're responsible for publishing all of that data to us from a single source. So either in a single feed, downloading them in a kind of at a single download at one time, or having them all available through the same API or endpoint. Why don't I stop and see if there are any quick questions before we move on to metadata requirements. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question, or you could post something to the chat, which I should have. Doesn't sound like we have any, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to talk about DPLA's metadata requirements. So DPLA really only requires about 5 metadata elements be in every record. The first is the data provider. So this is the name of the contributing institution. This is the name where the material ultimately resides. So if a service hub is sharing data with us from Penn State Erie, then the contributing institution is Penn State Erie. The hub's name goes in a property called provider. In that case, it would be PA Digital. But the data provider is the name of who is ultimately responsible for the content. It has to be in the metadata record somewhere we can find it. So it has to be in a distinct or a findable metadata field. So it can't be just one of several contributors or one of several publishers. It needs to be easy to find without having to actually read the data in the record, because we have to write directions for our transformations to know exactly which property to convert into the data provider. It does help if you can do some normalization of those names. Institutions have a tendency to use many different names for themselves. Just differences between Penn State University, period, Erie, the Barron College, or Penn State Erie, or Pennsylvania State University, comma, Erie. All of those will appear as completely different institutions because they're different strings when we intake that data, and then when we try to display it, they won't all display in the same, with the same name in a facet, in a field, in a list of institutions, for example. Next is the property called isShowNat. And this is a URL back to the object in its originating repository. So it's a link back to a landing page, a page that shows the object with metadata record in a context. It's not a link to a JPEG or a link to a TIFF file or a link to a PDF. It's a link to a page that shows the object within a context. And again, this is another really important field. It needs to be in a distinct or findable place. So it can't just be, one of several location properties or one of several identifier properties. We need to be able to find it. Title is really one of only two pieces of descriptive metadata that's required. Title does not have to be unique, but that certainly does help, and I'll show you some examples later. We would prefer it to be a descriptive title rather than just an identifier, and we would prefer it to not have brackets around it or ending periods unless it's multiple sentences. We do some cleanups to deal with that last issue. The only thing we're really going to evaluate is whether or not all of your records have a title, but our experience has shown us that the more descriptive the title is, the better, basically. Thumbnail, a thumbnail for an item is not actually technically a required property, but it's highly recommended if you can provide it. And you should have one for all images, although you may not have one for text, video, or audio because of the nature of those materials. But if you can provide a screenshot or a scan of a page or something like that, that is recommended. Just like the link to the item in context, this must be a URL directly to an image, not a landing page. So this is where we need a URL link to a JPEG or a URL link to a GIF or a PNG, preferably a smallish file. It will be displayed on the front end at 300 pixels on the longest side. So you don't need to provide something huge, but you also don't want to provide something tiny. If thumbnail is not available, do not supply a generic icon. We'll be supplying generic icons for items that don't have thumbnails in our front end. So we don't want to get a mix of different styles of icon. It kind of looks better and makes a better experience for users if they all are using the same generic icon. So that's why I say that thumbnail isn't necessarily required. If there isn't a thumbnail in a record, we will sub in our own generic icon in the interface. Rights is the other field that is at least somewhat descriptive that's required. Rights is a little bit complicated because you can provide us either a uncontrolled free text statement, which we would put in the DC rights property, or you can use a URI from rightstatement.org or creativecommons.org. So right now the requirement is either or. You may have both, but those two statements can't repeat or contradict each other. So you can't have a right statement URI that says this item is in copyright and then a free text statement that says some boilerplate like this item may or may not be in copyright, and it's up to you to determine that. So if you have those kinds of boilerplate statements and you want to start implementing standardized right statements, you're going to need to do work to make sure that those don't contradict each other or repeat each other. With the standardized right statement, we only want the URI. We don't want the label. We don't want the description. We'll provide those after we harvest the records. And we are encouraging all of our providers to use standardized right statements in all of their records. It has been a priority in the past and will be again to start working more with providers to make sure that more of those records have those statements. But for right now, either one is acceptable. The last thing, which I mentioned before, is a persistent identifier. And the persistent identifier is going to be used to create an ID for the DPLA record. So this needs to be an identifying string or number that will not change over time. So if you move your server to a different address, this number has to stay the same. If you move all your records to another system, this identifier needs to be the same. And that's because, as I mentioned, it's used to create the URL for the record in DPLA. So if the identifier changes, the URL changes, the record is in a different location, all of the links that anybody has created to the record break, all of the links that might be in one of our curated materials, a primary source set, a topic browse, an exhibit will break, and it's just not, beneficial to our users. That persistent identifier can be anywhere in the record. It can be a header element or a metadata element, but it must be unambiguous, again, like the other properties. It needs to be somewhere where we can consistently find it and don't have to pull it out of a list of other properties. It doesn't have to be a Perl or a handle or a PID or any other kind of formally persistent identifier. You're not required to implement a handle server or something like that, but it does have to remain the same over time. It has to be something that you feel reasonably confident won't be changing. This is what the kind of bird's eye view of the whole metadata application profile looks like. So the bubbles that are in blue are classes of properties, just groupings of properties in the record that are required. I'm going to go through what each of these bubbles represents in a minute. The empty ones, the white ones, are for contextual information. So the ORE aggregation, for example, holds administrative information about the record. So it has the things like the name of the contributing institution, the data provider, the name of the rights holder, the name of the hub. And each of those are an agent, so they could further be described with some other additional information. What you really need to know, though, is that within those core classes, there are just a list of properties that, that we will populate records with. So this is a previous version of the DPLA map, version 3.1. Version 3.1 is a little bit simpler, and the records that are currently coming out of our API conform to 3.1. But the overall structure hasn't changed a lot. It's just that with 5.0, we've added some additional information. What you currently will find in the API is 3.1, which is a little bit more simplified. The majority of the descriptive metadata goes in the source resource portion of the record. So for your purposes, all you need to do is share with us a metadata record that has these properties, and we'll handle mapping it into a DPLA record that conforms to our structure. As you can see, the source resource is pretty basic, mostly qualified Dublin Core terms. So things like collection, contributor, creator, date, description, language, publisher, relation, rights holder, subject. These are pretty basic ideas, basic metadata. Most of the metadata you provide us will be mapped into this part of the record, this class of of properties. The web resource is where we put the information about the digital object. So it's really just where we store the link to the thumbnail or the is shown at property. You can specify some other kinds of specific information about it. You could assert that it has its own right statement. You could provide a IIIF version in place of a thumbnail, and we would put that information in the section of the record that's the web resource. But it isn't really too important for you to understand because it's really just for the link to the landing page or the preview. As I mentioned, the aggregation, I apologize about the overlay of the images there. The aggregation is where the majority of the administrative information goes. The name of the institution providing the record, the data provider, the hub, which is the provider, the link to the record in its original context, and the thumbnail image technically go into this property and point to that web resource class that I listed previously. But as you can see, the majority of these elements are required because they're the basic administrative information that allows us to control the management of the object. We have a new property in 5.0 for the right statement. This really just allows us to model the difference between the text right statement and the standardized right statement. Again, all you really need to know is that you need to give us either a full text right statement or a URI for the right statement, and we'll handle mapping it to the correct place. In terms of the records that you share with us, so what I was just showing you is what DPLA, how DPLA models its own metadata. You share with us a metadata record that you can decide to model however you want. It just has to have those required properties in it, and then we'll take care of translating it into the DPLA record as the DPLA records are stored. We can't really recommend to you, or we do recommend to you actually, the easiest way to do this is to just use an application profile that uses Dublin Core and Europeana data model terms, because those are the elements that we use in our records. So you can essentially build something that mimics a DPLA map record with an application profile using those properties. At the end of this presentation, I'll give you a link to a page on our wiki that has some examples of application profiles and what those records would look like that you would share with us. If you can't use an application profile, we've seen the most success using just qualified Dublin Core. Mods also works well if you're careful. Mods is very robust and has a lot of different options, and so it's very easy to get your records not consistent with each other. But we don't recommend simple Dublin Core. It's just too simple to be able to model that administrative information that we need, the names of the organizations and the links and things like that. One of the other requirements for the metadata is that you give us one record for every digital object. There is flexibility about what digital object means, though. We don't necessarily mean digitized material, but we mean the descriptive record. So a digital object has to means everything that goes along with something, an intellectual entity, something you would create a descriptive metadata record for. So a single book, for example, rather than one for each page. It could also be a folder of objects that are presented together as a single multi-part item. So if your digitization unit decided to scan a whole folder and create a record, an object in your digital repository for the folder, that would be okay to share with us. That doesn't mean that we collect finding aids or collection records, but rather individual objects in digital repositories that have multiple parts or are complicated is fine. So this is an example of a record that represents a group of similar images that have been described together. So The thumbnail represents that there are multiple images. It's a little bit hard to see because this is black and white, but these are actually two images stacked on each other. And when I click through to that item, what I'm seeing again is a record for like a folder or a grouping of images that are related to each other. You can see it says 2 images. So because these images were very closely related in a kind of archival fashion, they decided to just create one object for the 2 things rather than create multiple identical records. This is another example of a folder of materials. So when I click through this, I'm going to get to the folder and all of its contents in one place. So here it is. This is at National Archives. If you follow that link, this is how National Archives has created the descriptive unit. And that's what we have a record for. There is an exception to this, which is with serial titles. With serial titles, we recommend you use the level of description that has the best data, even if it's the title level. We don't aggregate full text. As I mentioned before, we only aggregate metadata. And most issue level titles are not very unique at metadata at the issue level. So if we're talking about a series of newspapers, without getting the full text of these newspapers, there's no real unique information for each issue other than the date. So this really doesn't lead to a great searching experience because if you search for any term, you're going to get every single one of these records unless you know the exact date you're looking for. If it's something like, in this case, for the Memphis World, they actually had a big grant-funded project where they wrote individual metadata for each article within the newspaper. So that's great. Getting an individual object record for each article is great when you have the metadata, but in most cases you don't. So in that case, giving us a single record for the entire run of the newspaper is perfectly fine. And that's not something we would normally do for other kinds of multi-part, multi-volume works. But for newspapers, journals, serial items, this works pretty well. So from here, you would link out to the page at the site where you could browse through the issues. If we are ever able to incorporate full text, this situation will probably change. But for now, because we're dealing only with metadata and most serials are relying on pretty simple metadata, this is an acceptable kind of compromise. If you do have pretty rich descriptions at the issue level, then that's great. We can use those. I don't have an example in here, but the DC Hub recently gave us a Washington, DC newspaper, and they had original, unique descriptions for every single issue. So that worked great in this case. A couple of other collection policies. You need to have at least 50,000 records for us to get started. That's just to help us use our own resources wisely. It also means that you'll probably have been able to encounter and work out a lot of issues that you might have in your own aggregation before we get started. Secondly, we're pretty open about the types of content that we aggregate, but at this point, we don't work with things like data sets, lecture notes, presentations, things that are kind of more on the unpublished end of the spectrum rather than published. We do have a statement online now about our collection guidelines, and it addresses these particular categories of material. That's not to say that these are things we don't accept, but that we have a policy within each of these about generally what we're looking for versus what we're not. In each case, it's an individual decision, really. So there's not a hard and fast rule that we do take preprints, but we don't take lecture notes or something like that. But there's kind of a rule of thumb outlined in the collection guidelines for each of these areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about metadata quality, just very simply, actually, before we move on to talk about that ingest process. So to create metadata that works well in DPLA, we have to acknowledge that DPLA has its own context, and we have to create records that work for that context. So the context of DPLA is that it's a very heterogeneous environment. Not every aggregation is heterogeneous, but DPLA really is. As I said in just a minute ago, there are some things we're not really looking for, but generally speaking, we've taken a lot of diverse content, diverse in formats, diverse in subject area and theme, diverse in audience, diverse in age, things like that. We also rely on pretty basic metadata. It's probably most closely aligned with the Dublin Core terms or qualified Dublin Core set of elements. So it was not developed to capture nuance, domain-specific information. So to work well in this context, data has to work well in that kind of simplified domain. So if a record for a biology monograph, for example, had several hundred taxonomic names indexed to it, and those can't be mapped to something in the metadata record, well, that data is lost in the aggregation. As with the newspapers, if the newspaper doesn't have any descriptive metadata about the issue, only has full text, that's not going to translate well to this context because we rely on metadata and not full text. And as I also described previously, we rely on item level metadata. So if you don't have individual records for materials or groupings of materials within a collection, but only have a single collection level finding aid or record, that's not going to work in the DPLA context either. So I think of quality in our records as kind of a pyramid of things. At the base are the really big areas to get correct and consistent, the kind of technical problems, like whether or not values are present and well-formed. Once those are taken care of, we can start to care a little bit or pay more attention to the content itself to see if the values in the fields are meaningful and if they are adhering to standards. And it's only after that that we can really look at it and say, is this complete? Is this a robust record? Generally at DPLA, we can't get to that level of analysis because we spend so much time on those technical problems. So the kinds of data issues that DPLA is going to care about in terms of metadata quality are things like this: granularity, which has to do with whether or not your source schema has more or less level of detail than ours does, and how that transformation happens between those two. Inappropriate values are kind of a content concern, but at a very gross level. I'm talking about like using the wrong metadata property for something. For example, using a date field for a digitization date rather than the creation date, which is how we would interpret date. Also things like meaningless or missing data, confusing or incomplete data. We generally don't have the capacity or knowledge of the source material to review those kinds of things, but they'll jump out if they look incorrect. Lack of normalization is a problem, and that means inconsistent use of metadata and vocabulary across sets. So using two different ways of formatting dates within the feed, for example, is a kind of lack of normalization. Noise is basically meaningless data, phrases like unknown or NA, or just punctuation, dash, dash. Those values, again, might provide some information in their home context where they're used consistently, but in DPLA, not everybody is using the same way of conveying that, so it just becomes kind of noise that doesn't make sense. Finally, data that doesn't adhere to standards does stick out, and that's primarily if it doesn't adhere to the metadata schema standard. So if you're using properties that aren't formulated properly within the XML or that aren't part of the declared schema, that can cause some problems. But we're not going to be looking at whether or not all your subject headings are from Library of Congress or something like that, or whether all your names are from the name authority file. We don't get to that level of detail with the actual content. So finally, I want to talk about the data ingest process and how that will all work. I'll maybe pause again to see if there's any quick questions related to metadata or data quality that we've gone over?
Yes, I have a question about the thumbnail. So you said, are they all displayed at exactly the same size?
So the front end code will actually resize it. So if you give us something that's a little bit more or a little bit less than, I don't know why my slide went up, sorry. If you give us something that's a little bit more, a little bit less than 300, it'll resize it to 300 on the longest side or 300 in height. So you don't have to give us images that are exactly 300 pixels, but that's how they'll be displayed.
Okay, that's exactly asked and answered. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how this process works. Once you get your data into a single feed and you have it all consistent and you have all the required properties in it, then we're ready to harvest it from you and make it into new DPLA records. So the overall process is very iterative. I know this has a lot of bubbles on this graph. We'll go over the steps separately, but basically you can see there's kind of 3 rounds of work that happens: an initial analysis, a mapping, and then a QA. So the first is the initial analysis of the data. So I do this myself with you at the hub. I typically used a couple of different strategies to get a good look at your data. So if you're using OAI, I can look at it in a browser. I can download it using some Python scripts. And eventually what I try to do with everybody's data is to get it into an open, refined spreadsheet. And so if you are sharing less than about 200,000 records, then I can usually deal with that. If you're sharing them in some technology using some method other than OAI, that's fine. I have successfully been able to get around a lot of different standards to be able to get this into Open Refine. So once I've got it there, I can analyze it for those kind of basic things we talked about a couple of slides ago. I can see if all the required properties are there. I can see if there's lots of noisy data or things that are mapped to the wrong place or things that are mapped inconsistently. And I can give you feedback on that, and we'll iterate through that a couple of times until we get the data to a point where it looks good to me, it looks consistent, it looks like it's got the basic, levels of quality that we need to be able to move on to the next step. And that next step is to create a crosswalk. And this is just a table that shows how your properties in your record would be mapped to the properties in the DPLA record. So you can see a couple of different institutions here. And so, for example, Empire State Digital Network, in their records, they would put their dates in a date created property, and we would map whatever's in that date created property to our date property. So we create this spreadsheet so that you at the hub and I at DPLA can both know that we're on the same page. We've made, we know what each property means and where it needs to ultimately end up. And then we make that into code. So we're currently transforming it into using a language called Scala. And that will create a new record according to the DPLA map specification, and it'll be in the JSON format. So it won't be XML, it'll be JSON, but that's just another way of creating data records. We'll store and make available in our API our version of the record in DPLA map that conforms to DPLA map, along with your original version of the map record. So if you give us Dublin Core records and we have DPLA map records, when people get records through the API, they'll get the DPLA map record and your original Dublin Core record nested inside one of the properties. So they'll actually still be able to see what was in the original record in case something in the transformation went awry. We have a copy of the canonical data. So once we have, this is actually to write the mapping and to test out the mapping. Once we have the mapping correct, we'll go ahead and harvest that content. Harvest it from whatever your original source was, OAI or Resource Sync or whatever, and we'll actually map it according to the mapping that we had just kind of negotiated and written out. We'll then perform a number of enrichments on the data. So enrichments are pieces of code that do some kind of data remediation or normalization to the record. More correctly, these are normalizations and enrichments. So normalizations do things like create consistency. So they split up fields at delimiters. So a lot of times content DM will spit out all of the subjects in a single property with a semicolon between each of them. So a normalization would split those up into separate subject headings. It would remove white space that's extraneous at the beginning and end of a property. Enrichments will actually add new information to the record. So an enrichment might match the format term photograph in your property to the DCMI type image and add back a property of type with the value image to the DPLA map version of the record. So normalizations just kind of clean up what you have, and enrichments add a little bit of enhanced information to the DPLA version of the record. We really only have 3 or 4 enrichments, and they're kind of constantly being tweaked and hopefully improved. They are for date, to create a begin and end date based on a single date or a date range, DCMI type, language, and geographic coordinates. We try to supply geographic coordinates for place names that we can recognize to help populate a map-based browse of the content, which has currently been taken down from the front end because we're trying to fix up that geographic enrichment. So basically, the records are mapped, meaning that the new DPLA record is just created with your original values, and then we go through these steps of normalization and enrichment to kind of just polish them off a little bit. So the first time we go through all of that, we'll next do QA. So we have a pretty basic QA interface. It's just like a digital repository interface with facets and search and results. But instead of showing you an individual object, we'll show you our new DPLA record side by side with your original record so that we can see how well the mapping went. So we can't see the collection in this particular part of the original record, but presumably somewhere in here there's a DC is part of, and that with the value historic Fort Atkinson, which is what got mapped to this collection title property. We also have a number of reports that we'll give you that will give you lists of all of the values that were in all of the records. For example, here's subjects. So the subject New York Philharmonic occurred in 35,237 records, and so on. And then this one, I'm not sure what this other report is, but it's just another kind of report. And all of those things together will help us to do QA together. So I will do some QA on the data. Once I think it looks good, I'll share it with you. You can do some QA on the data. And once we're in agreement that it looks good, that's when we can publish that data, make it live on the DPLA website. This is, of course, an old screenshot from our site before we redid it earlier this year, so I guess I need to update my slides. But that's really how the first ingest goes. We do this negotiation back and forth about the crosswalk, we write the mapping, we do the QA. When we do re-ingest, we schedule them with you to occur along some sort of schedule, probably quarterly. So it would happen 4 times a year, every 3 months, or we could do them more frequently or less frequently based on basically how much new content you have. And what we'll do is we'll set up a schedule for the particular months that we'll re-harvest your content. And then once the month gets closer, we'll set up a schedule. We'll set a target week for when we're going to ingest the content. And then we'll have a dashboard set up where you can keep track of the issues in our ticketing system as we do those re-ingests. So you can see a ticket here for a re-ingest of California Digital Library. So at this point, your next steps are really to work on your data aggregation and your metadata quality. That's really your #1 priority at this point. You can contact me when you think you're like about 70% there. You think you've got close to 50,000 records. You think the records are really consistent. You think they've got all of the recommended or required properties. And at that point, I can start reviewing the data with you and giving you some feedback. So you don't have to wait until you've got everything perfect. I can certainly give you feedback as you're moving along. But, you know, you want to get at least to a spot where you think you've got the easy stuff figured out, the stuff you know how to handle. If you are a hub that has applied and been accepted, then you do have the data exchange agreement to fill out, and that needs to be filled out before we can make records live. But I can start working with you on your analysis and feedback on the records before that. We also have a form that we have you fill out once we're ready to start harvesting, that will give us all of the kind of technical information we need about your endpoint so that we can harvest that content. I mentioned some helpful documentation. Really, you can find all of this now at this documentation and tools page on the DPLA Pro site, which hopefully will open. So we have links here to the collection development guidelines, the metadata application profile, some servers. We've got some tools here, crosswalks, sample open refine templates, XSLT samples. We also have some quality guidelines, DPLA metadata quality guidelines, some workshops on how to use some different analysis tools, guidelines for geographic and right statements. I mentioned earlier about the application profile sample or example that you could use. That's in this introduction to the DPLA metadata model, which is a really great document if you are kind of unfamiliar with our application profile and how we use metadata at DPLA. There's a lot of good information in here, but at the end we have sample records and we have suggested crosswalks. So we have a suggested crosswalk for an application profile, and we have sample records of an application profile. So these can be really helpful if you're trying to figure out what your records that you want to share with DPLA look like. So these are all examples of records that are shared with DPLA, and then DPLA will transform them into the kinds of records they'll share through their API. So with that, we're ready to go to questions. You can actually escape off of this, stop the screen share. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we can go ahead and have some conversation, ask some questions, and I will thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to go ahead and stop this now.